welcome back. I think that we had a really good day yesterday. I hope that you feel that we had the opportunity to be very, very flexible and nimble, and the discussions had depth. We're glad to welcome back James Smudgy Mitchell.
Thank you, Mayor.
Glad to see you this morning. I think today will start us off with context for a lot of the discussions. So we had a lot of time to talk about what our priorities, our thoughts, what we thought were goals for our council and our city. And now today I think we start off with some context about how we're going to be able to do big things financially and how long-term they can be. And we'll start there, and then we'll keep working. Thank you very much for a great day, but for helping us be organized, but more importantly, for helping us feel like this is our ownership topic. So with that, Marcus, do you need to say anything? Who does it go to?
Thank you, ma'am. So really quickly, the format for this morning, we're going to have a presentation from Ryan, followed immediately by a presentation from Tracy and Taiwo. Capture your, and then, if it makes sense, then we'll briefly have some Q&A as it relates to both of those. But it makes sense to take some of the questions immediately after Ryan's. We'll do that. We'll just need to keep it short. And then, so what I'm asking you to do, if you have questions, comments, concerns, ideas, what have you, while they're speaking, capture them on Post-it notes so you have them. If we need to place them later, again, our parking lot over here to my left. We will take a break after the mini Q&A, and then we'll dive into getting into your work around allocating funds from the bond funds. Okay? All right.
Good. Stephanie, is this on? Okay. Good morning, guys. My name is Ryan Bergman. I'm the budget director. I was recently promoted within the last couple of months when Phil Rieger was promoted to General Services Director. I know that it's a very prestigious position historically in Charlotte, especially the mayor, also Kurt Walton, Ruffin Hall, some very impressive people. So I don't take that lightly, and hopefully I can live up to it. I have had the privilege the last 18 months of being part of the budget team, though. We've been able to keep the team together. I spent that time as deputy director, and I even got to talk to you guys on some thrilling presentations such as calculating a revenue-neutral tax rate, understanding pension systems. So I'll try to keep that excitement level up. That's why we had it going at 8 in the morning here for you. So the purpose of the presentation, historically on our budget outlook at the retreat, we talk, of course, about the general fund outlook. We also talk a lot about the economics behind it. I want to do it a little bit differently this year, especially with some of the surveys we've had from council members on trying to understand specific things about the budget. I'm, of course, going to do everything on the general fund outlook, talk about the capital outlook, but I also want to spend a little bit of time explaining how the budget is structured so you can really understand where your property tax dollars are going. So here's my only economic slide, and we do have a city economist who will say a lot of the same things that Mr. Vittner was able to say yesterday, but I actually wanted this slide up here for a different reason, so I can draw a little bit of a contrast and answer the question that we'll typically get: why are there any budget concerns when Charlotte is booming so substantially? And this is the big reason here. North Carolina is a little bit unique in that the only growth that the city is able to capture are things that are new construction, whether they be improvements to an existing home or whether it be a new condo in a vacant lot or something to that effect. So the normal value increase of the same house, which was previously selling for $100,000, now selling for $165,000, we actually don't get any benefit from that in our budget. And the reason for that is the revenue neutral tax rate calculation in the state of North Carolina. It is notable that if we did not have that revenue neutral tax rate, we would not have reset last year from 48 cents to 34 cents, and we would actually have $200 million more in revenue. So this is a little chart about how the city's budget is organized. It's simplified. There's some other things out there like internal service funds that aren't relevant right now. But the big point of this is that those first three buckets on the left, the governmental funds, that's what I'm going to spend most of the time talking about. These are where your property tax dollars and your sales tax dollars that we have control over how they're allocated are going. I'll talk one slide about enterprise funds in a second, but those are primarily supported by user fees, with CATS being a bit of an outlier in that they have their own dedicated sales tax. And then finally, the ones on the right, the special revenue funds, these are restricted. So we have a dedicated revenue source, such as hotel tax for tourism, and that cannot be spent on anything else. So it cannot be spent on police officers or affordable housing. We have no control over that, and that's why they're separate from our governmental funds. Just wanted to have one slide about enterprise funds. Each of these will come to a budget workshop in the next few months and talk about their situation. I did talk with all of their financial people. There's currently no concerns to report on that front. They'll talk a little bit about rates and everything at the next workshop. I did want to note on behalf of our airport director that one very good story that's happening with aviation is the state recently passed legislation to give airport improvement funds to the airports in North Carolina. So that's $25 million that we wouldn't have got last year that the Charlotte Airport is getting this year that they're able to use for airport improvement projects. So this is my esteemed graphic artist work here, trying to explain the property tax and the sales tax. And these are by no means the only revenue that go into these buckets, but this is probably the most important question you'd get asked about where our taxes are going. Our property tax, we have $497 million. Most of it goes to the general fund. And then we also have, at the very bottom, a small thing called pay-as-you-go fund, which is kind of a mix between operating and capital that I'll explain a little bit more about. But then our debt service fund. So when we take on all of these capital projects each year, this is the area that we use to pay the debt on them. So that basically supports our capital program.
Hey, Ryan, are those 2019 numbers?
These are FY20 numbers. So we'll start with the general fund outlook. So I kind of grayed out the rest so you can see it. So 500 of the million comes from your taxes. There's also other things such as utility franchise tax. There's licenses and fees. So for instance, a developer will have to pay a fee, which will support the planning program, which is run through the general fund. But the general fund, $727 million. This is police, fire, solid waste, CDOT planning, but, and you'll see a theme here, the general fund is dominated substantially by public safety. Just police and fire alone make up 57% of the general fund budget. So a lot of information on this slide, but it's all good news at this point. We did end preliminary because the audit will be presented to you, the Budget and Effectiveness Committee, in the coming weeks. But it does look like we ended the year with a $1.5 million surplus. That's after our reserve requirements are met. So what that means is our own internal rule to ensure that we're strong financially, we hold 16% of our general fund in reserves. So when the general fund grows a little bit, we have to take money and put it towards the reserves. The state actually only requires us to do 8%, so that's really a best financial practice. Moving on to the mid-year, and it's very early. A lot of our revenue sources, well, mainly sales tax and utility franchise tax, they actually operate on 3-month lags from the state. So while we have strong numbers so far in each of those, it's simply too early to draw any large conclusions from that. But on the expenditure side, we didn't have a hurricane this year. We seem to be tracking well within budgets, and it looks like it's all positive news on this front within the year. So moving on to the FY21 outlook. So we did this, or Phil did this last year when he presented to you, and I wanted to do it the same way. So our starting point for a budget, the way that we build it internally and check our outlook, is to take the approved budget that you currently have and then build in the changes to it to see where you stand. So we'll take the revenue update, and then we'll build some of the expenditures on top of it that we have to do, and then we'll have a preliminary variance, and then we'll talk about a salary increase, which is on top of that variance. And on the left there, you'll be able to kind of follow along. It'll update as you go. So the initial base revenue forecast calls for about $19.7 million. I did want to give you guys a perspective of what we're projecting. When I say we, I'm speaking primarily of our economist, Dr. Tazafor. What we're projecting in FY21, but you will see compared to 18 and 19 growth that it is a little bit conservative. And the reason for that is simply, as I mentioned, we're so early in the year that we have to plan conservatively in case there's any type of a modest slowdown. Unfortunately, there's one key revenue challenge that we'll deal with this year that's going to reduce this 19.7 by a couple of $1 million. Last year at the retreat, we talked about how the county changing their property tax and us not changing ours can result in a change the next year to sales tax. So the county controls how sales tax is allocated within the county between the city and the towns. They can either do it based on population or they can do it based on total tax levy. They've historically done total tax levy. That is in their best interest. And so what that means is the city doing a revenue neutral tax rate last year and the county increasing by 1.99 cents results in us taking a bit of an impact to sales tax this year that we have to make up in other ways. So that leads to a $2.2 million loss from our growth projection. It also leads to about a $600,000 loss to our debt service fund. So moving on to some of the technical adjustments, and I won't spend much time on this slide. These are basically some of the check-the-box things you have to do when you're building the outlook. Your mandatory contractual increases, and then the biggest thing is if we have salary increases, new positions, anything that are over 6 months, 8 months, 9 months, we have to annualize the cost the next year. So now that we have to pay for a full 12 months for some of those actions, the cost increases by 4.3. So I want to be careful about this. These are fiscal challenges, but in my opinion, they are all positive. So I want to make sure that we understand that these are positive actions, but they do result in additional cost for the general fund. The big one is Algiers. So historically, up until FY20, for 3 straight years, the retirement increase was 0.25%. However, the state board made a decision that they were falling a little bit behind, and they increased it to 1.2%. So that's more than quadrupling the increase, and it results in $3.8 million that we do have to send to the retirement system. As I note on the slide there, this is about half for law enforcement officers through their system. The second challenge we have is opening a new infill station next year. So this is on Clanton and 77 in District 3. It's a good story. We paid for a lot of the equipment. We started the staffing in FY20, and this $1 million is essentially the annualized costs of those employees that we're adding. This is a fiscal challenge, but it's very positive. It should help substantially with some of the response times initiatives the chief is undergoing. Police separation allowance is something you'll consistently see on slides in the state of North Carolina because it's still relatively new, so it's building. The costs are building each year. It's when a police officer retires at 50, 52, wherever they are, the state pays them a supplement until they're 62 years old. And I say the state, it's actually the city funding it. The state requires the city to fund it. So it's essentially for police to bridge the gap between retirement and Social Security. Of course, our police officers certainly deserve this, but it is a fiscal challenge that we have to build into the budget each year. And then finally, with fire retirement, I've personally been involved with discussions with the Fire Retirement Board. Our CFO, Kelly Flannery, is also on the retirement board for firefighters. There's been discussions over the last couple of years on some changes that board may want to ask the state to approve. And the idea would be that they shore up some of the small things on their end related to pension spiking, perhaps, or the use of an exorbitant amount of overtime. And on our end would be the idea that if we're okay with that, we potentially start building our contribution and kind of attack that problem financially. So they are planning on going to the state, I believe, next session. And it's something that we do want to be financially ready for, although we're likely not going to be locked into that. That'll be a decision. So that leaves us with, and I don't want to use the word surplus because there's no salary increase in this yet. We have a $6.2 million variance, and this is intentional in that we do all of our budgeting, work with departments over a multi-year lens, and we make sure that we don't put ourselves into a position where we couldn't cut out the salary increase and still support ourselves. So we make sure that we don't start upside down with this. But of course, we always want to work towards a new salary increase each budget year, which brings us to the budget challenge that we currently have. So the new salary increase this year is about $13 million. It is predominantly public safety, about 78% of it. So these are our police officers, these are our firefighters. It's about $3 million higher than it typically would have been the last few years. And the reason for that is some of the positive steps we've taken with police and fire pay over the last couple of years. If you'll remember, we had a public safety comparison presentation where we talked about trying to get, as a first step, to the median for comparable cities. And so we took a 2-year plan with police. We took a 3-year plan with fire. So there are some costs. I do want to point that out just so you understand that we've already built some pretty aggressive costs into this to continue working on some of those problems. So
Does that include a 3% broadband increase?
yes, yep. This is 3% for all general employees, and then 1.5% for public safety, and then the steps that they'll get. One thing I do want to point out about the budget challenge is it's less than 1% of our budget. So compared to some of the ones that I've seen from past retreats, it is something that we feel we can try to manage. We have some strong ideas internally. I have a very good staff of analysts who are working on a number of things. But I do want to point out that some of these challenges do get a little bit more difficult in that we've spent the last 2 years, the 2 budget years, really aggressively attacking utilization and efficiency within the general fund budget. And so we've reduced $12 million from the general fund based on those 2 initiatives and really haven't impacted service levels. So what that's resulted in is our year-end surplus has been getting smaller, which is good. We're not appropriating money that we don't need. But it also means that there's not a lot of low-hanging fruit for the budget. Regardless, that's why we have the 15 people in the budget office. We are going to continue to work with departments. I wouldn't read a whole lot into the box. All that means is the way that we do our outlook, if we wanted to take our services last year or this year and do them again next year, we feel that the property tax rate would be able to support that with some minor changes on our end. This does not imply any kind of service level changes. Before I move on from the general fund to the capital program, I did want to take a couple of slides and talk about one of the key initiatives that has really dominated the general fund budget over the last couple of years. So what you'll see on the screen is police officers and the concern that we've had with staffing. So it's kind of a spectrum there where the things on the left are things that we could really attack we could really help with. And it moves over to some of the concerns on the right where the city really doesn't have a lot of control over. So a lot of the big driver is just the age of the force. As the force grew 25, 30 years ago, it's resulted in a lot of police officers that are just starting to retire. The other complicating factor is now that the state has the separation allowance, which I mentioned, there's really no, there's limited reason for police officers to continue past retirement age because that separation allowance stops at age 62 no matter what. So whether you start with a retirement at 51 or 55, the argument is you are costing yourself money if you stay too long. Ms. Eisel. It's 0.085, I believe. It's basically an amount that's bridging the gap between Social Security and the pension. So let's see. Yeah, it's just a calculation. I don't have the multiplier in front of me, but it's a calculation. So on a career, if somebody has a pension of $50,000, they might expect like a $12,000 separation allowance or something to that effect.
Ryan, I think another question that might be helpful is that when you think about the total compensation, I was told, and I don't know if this is accurate, but it's usually about 90% of what they make, and they're 52 years old, and then they can go out and have a second career, so you end up really having the ability to have that. So it would be good to know, but I think with the extra agreement, it's about 90% of current salary for retirement. So, but would you please check that? Because sometimes I get 8 and 9 mixed up, and it might be 80%. But I think that's the question. I think that's what drives it. If you can go out and make that much in a pension and still have a second career, you're in a much better position financially for your family, your lifestyle.
Absolutely, and that's why, at least in my opinion, it's not any of our doing when our police officers retire as soon as they're able. It's simply the financial thing to do for them.
So all of the 69 average the last 3 years have been eligible for retirement. The 57 are people who did not reach retirement age. They just left the department.
Correct. So there's nobody that was terminated or anything with that 57. These are people that left the police department after being fully trained police officers of their own accord.
And do we know inside of that how many left for a different police department or how many got out of the profession? Or
We have some of that data in 2018. We don't have that detailed data in 2019. I do have an update that I'll show in a couple of slides, but it doesn't get into that granular level quite yet. But we can.
one of those is more controllable on our end than the other.
Yes, correct. And there are a chunk of people that, as Chief Putney will tell you, will typically leave after 3 years to go to federal employment, and that was their goal all along. So that group of people we're probably never going to be able to hold on to.
Ryan, there was also a spike in the federal Secret Service area where they were really recruiting actively officers from good departments.
Hey, Brian, since we're on the topic of staffing, how many positions are still open with CMPD?
There's 182 open right now. That is a hard number that is open. That does not count some of the temporary employees that are filling some of those roles. Temporary, fully trained police officers.
Ryan, on the retirement, they continue to get a pension after they're 62, don't they?
Yes.
So what we're talking about is a supplemental pension from the retirement age until they're 62, that they also have a permanent pension.
Absolutely.
That's where you get to your 90% number. The supplement is just something that makes up a difference between that permanent pension and the Social Security. Because that, in other words, that their pension from the city steps down when they start receiving Social Security.
So the typical, most of us would get Social Security at a certain age, and what they, like 65, 70, whatever it is nowadays. But this allows them that benefit at the age of 50, after 30 years and a certain age, 50.
Yeah, at 62 though.
So 62 is the earliest age at which you can start receiving Social Security. You can start receiving Social Security at 62 at a lesser amount, and you can choose how much you want to get and when. So the earliest eligibility date for Social Security is when this particular benefit stops. I did have a question about Elgers as well, which, by the way, is local government retirement system, for anybody who doesn't know. They had a pretty substantial deficit, and they were talking about steps they might have to take to bring themselves up in terms of the local contributions to match their liabilities and their assets.
Yep.
So do we need to look forward to further increases in our contributions?
Yeah, absolutely. So previously it was called a stabilization policy, where they only wanted it to go up by 0.25% no matter what. They determined actuarially that wasn't enough, so they took the step last year of overriding that policy and doing 1.2%. They did 1.2% again this year, and I would suspect they'll do 1.2% again next year. It's still funded in the 90% range, so it's not. It's one of the stronger pension systems in the country at the state level. You know, as a financial person, I certainly support the steps that they're taking.
So Ryan, so as a recovering former budget director, I was trying to sit on my hands with this one. Mayor and Council, there is good news that what was occurring. So in Ryan's setup, we realized this problem a couple of years ago, and there have been some changes in CMPD that starts to address this.
Right, and so I'll move on to the next slide. So these are some of the things that we've done over the last 2 years to try to attract lateral officers better, to try to retain the officers we do have. So in 19, we had a 4.5% top pay increase for police officers. We had 2 step increases to allow people to move up more. In FY20, we were even more aggressive with 6.5%, and we reduced the number of steps to get to top pay. So it starts to look, at least in my opinion, attractive for a police officer to come to Charlotte knowing that they might be able to get in at step 6, step 7, and you only have to get to step 12, so 5 or 6 years, to get up to that top step. I do want to point out that that does assume a 4-year degree, because that's how our pay plan is structured, with a 5% stipend for a 2-year degree, a 10% stipend for 4-year. There's more 4-year degrees than there is anything else. I also wanted to point out that this is just police officers. This is not sergeants or majors or anything like that. So these are really the police officers. And the median pay increase of $65,700 to $71,500 might not sound substantial when you think about it from a one officer perspective, but this is essentially shifting the entire data set, that 8 or 9%. So it is fairly substantial, and it's a big jump over an 18-month period. So I just wanted to really make the point that we've been very aggressive in the general fund trying to tackle this issue. And then I wanted to come back to that previous slide and provide the update as we have now. So over the last couple of years, Chief Putney has really increased the number of lateral hire police officers. You can see the substantial increase. 10 officers is a pretty small data set to try to draw any big conclusions from, but it is nice to see that the number of officers who resigned, which peaked in 2018, has, at least in 2019, started to go back down. We still have the concern with retirements. We do expect that to continue over the next 2 years as we kind of look at when eligibility is going to occur for retirements. But overall, while I don't want to say that this still isn't a key concern for us, we were able to mitigate anything from losing additional officers from where we were a year ago. So we feel like we've taken very aggressive steps, putting a lot of money, or you guys have put a lot of money into it, and kind of plugged the gap for us.
Brian, do you have, or does Chief have, or could we get something that would show like a 3 or a 5-year timeline of retirement eligibility within the department, so that we've got, I heard you say over the next 2 years we expect to kind of keep the same pace, but I think it might be helpful too to know how we project out over a little bit longer time period with who's eligible, given that from what you just said, you're almost certain to retire when you become eligible now.
Yeah, we actually do. We have that information. I'm sorry, I could have included it as a appendix slide for us, but we do have that information. What it'll show is that 2020 seems to be down a little bit, not a whole lot, and then 2021, for whatever reason, goes up pretty substantially. So that's kind of what I would expect, that 2021, calendar year 2021, to be a year with a lot of retirements. So we'll have to be really active trying to attract lateral officers, making sure that we retain people, really the same steps that we've taken. But yeah, we can absolutely get you that information. Okay, so before I move on to the debt service fund, which supports our capital program, talk a little bit about that. I just wanted one slide on the PAYGO fund. So this is our smallest fund. We've had it for many years, and it's kind of a mixture between operating costs and capital costs. You'll see here some of the initiatives that we do from this fund. The big reason and the big advantage of this fund compared to the general fund is, take trees, for instance. If we put $1 million into a tree program, that money is going to stay in that account until it is spent, regardless of fiscal years or anything like that. So it's a life-to-date account. So we've supported some of these programs through there. It also allows us, like on the building repair side, to General Services will prioritize projects each year. They'll get money, and they could be vastly different projects, but it's really about maintenance, keeping our building in shape, things like that. And then we also use it, a substantial chunk of it, for technology upgrades, whether it be with information and technology, but also in police. And then moving on to the final bucket, the debt service fund, where you'll see about $120 million of property and sales tax revenue that goes in each year to support debt payments on our capital program. Yep.
I'm sorry, could you go back to the comment made at the beginning that, I'm sorry. Could you go back to the comment that you made in the beginning when you said that when there's a property tax, when there's the value of someone's home goes up, we do not capture that incremental increase?
Yeah, so we do the revenue neutral calculation. So this past year, we captured 8 years of value increases, which was about 40%. But then we reset our tax rate so that 40% doesn't actually help us.
Oh, so just for this year, you mean?
Well, it's for ours. So
Well, it's not an assessed value.
right,
Yet.
right.
But if you keep the same millage rate every year, then aren't you going to capture that value?
Well, if you kept the same millage rate, it would be considered a tax increase because it would be above the revenue neutral rate.
On a year-to-year basis, the valuation is kept the same, so the tax stays the same. Valuation basis only changes when you do a revaluation.
Yeah.
And when you do that, you also reset your tax rate so that your total proceeds are the same as they would have been if you hadn't had a revaluation.
Right, which is what we did this year.
Right.
I think the question is, if I add a sunscreen porch or something, or add a bathroom, that value then goes up for that revenue neutral value. So if you do a $15,000 or $20,000 improvement, you get to tax that. But as long as we're in the 4 years, that tax remains based on the value, the same.
Oh, just for that time period?
For the 4 years,
Okay.
until you go back for another reval.
Got it.
But you get a new, whatever you add to, whether it's an improvement on an existing property or build a new house, that's where your growth comes.
Got it, okay.
So in this slide, the property tax growth in 18 and 19, that 2.5 and 2.6%, that would entirely be people adding things to their own homes or businesses plus new construction. So that's what makes up all of that growth. And the reason I think it's important for you guys, just like as a budget office and a city manager, we get asked the question, home values are increasing so much, where is all that money going? And this is kind of the answer, that we do have a limited growth. It's not the value on a home that doesn't change that we get to use for our budget purposes.
Ryan, so when you're looking at that, what is the value of the various cranes and commercial construction as a part of the property tax? How does that really impact it? Because I think there's a relationship different with commercial usually than houses or residents.
I don't have the split with me. I can get you that, but I mean, if there's cranes and they're building something, that's really going to be what's going to help drive that 2%, that 2.6% is all of the new construction in some of our key areas.
So new bathrooms and sunrooms don't get to 2.5% growth, huh?
I'm not sure what the cutoff is that the county uses. I know garages, they'll reassess. I would assume a new room they would, but I don't think that's our driver now.
Has the county committed to a 4-year interval between revaluations?
That's certainly their goal. I talked to the assessor on Friday. Me and Kelly, our CFO, had a meeting with him to talk about a number of things. That's still what they're shooting for. That's still their goal. But realistically, they can't commit to it until they actually do it, which could be a different board. But that is their plan.
Because the problem we had this time was you reapportioned the property tax according to changes in the value of properties, and there were some pretty wild swings. And a lot of people with low incomes in houses that have been valued at $100,000, say, doubled, and really got hurt. So we need smaller steps.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that as the assessor, Ken Joyner, will tell you, this past one coming from the depths of the recession through all these boom years was about as substantial of a revaluation as we'll go through. Okay, so moving on to our debt service program, which of course is managed more by our CFO and finance than it is the budget office. I will speak on her stead. We do 2 different types of debt typically. The most common one is our bonds. Those are what would go before the voters. So what the voters are voting on is that regardless of what happens, they're going to pledge property tax value to pay for that debt. And so that's a little bit different than certificates of participation, which we'll commonly refer to as COPs, in that these are more similar to a mortgage in that you're pledging an asset for the debt. And we would typically use the COPs on things like a police station or a fire station. And the bonds on transportation projects, roads, things like that. So this past year, FY19 and FY20, we've tried to enhance our capital program, working collaboratively with General Services and CDOT, amongst others. We have the capital dashboard out now. We've taken a very close look at our project management tracking. We've revised a lot of our templates. We did a very detailed closeout process last year. What was happening is there was small chunks of money in a lot of different places that was being held in case something happens with that project. But that's not really the best way to do budgets. So last year was substantial in that we reappropriated a lot of that money to use for current capital needs. But the most substantial change that we did in our capital program is the introduction of a planning fund. So this is important in that it allows us to take some of our big projects that we anticipate being on a future bond and know a lot more about them from a cost standpoint before they go in front of the bond. So this is what was missing before. We currently have 8 projects into it, which some of them hopefully will lead into future bonds, and we'll have a better understanding of what things will cost.
Hey, Ryan?
Yep.
Have we finished the process of kind of cleaning up the capital program, that resulted in issues like the Cross Charlotte Trail or the JCC and so on? I mean, are we at a point now where we think we've got a good handle on when we're going to fund and how much it's going to cost?
I don't think I'm the person to answer that definitively. I believe so. General Services did include in your pre-reads a project list of all the projects, and there was not a whole lot of problems there on their end, but we will bring them in at the next budget committee and the budget workshop to talk more specifically about some of those projects. But I mean, in my opinion, we're certainly in a much better spot than we were a year or 2 ago.
Okay.
I want to say I think very much in the pre-read data, I mean, that list was pretty well
Right.
defined, and I thought a major difference, so kudos to you guys for the process and what you're doing, because we actually will know which ones they are and specifically, and the scope is not as large as what I think most of us imagine.
Good. Thanks.
And related to that, I wanted to thank Julia Martin, assistant to the city manager, who took on that pre-read process and managed it between all departments, and I thought did a great job. So let's talk a little bit about where we are in our capital plan. We're still in a unique spot in that the Big Ideas bond occurred a number of years ago and actually goes through this upcoming bond. So we still have as of right now, a $197 million bond that's going to occur in FY21. So this amount is planned, not approved, because it is a future year. And here it is on the screen, but I will tell you that because this is the last of the Big Ideas bond, every single one of these projects either is a typical year-to-year program like the sidewalk program, or it is additional money from previous bonds. So and that doesn't mean that it's solving cost overages. It means that this was the plan all along to put the money in at this point. So this is something that also we'll talk to Liz with CDOT and Phil with General Services and talk about updates on each of these projects as we try to build from here, which is the planned in the most recent budget, to next year where you would actually physically approve the bond that would go before the voters, including any tinkering that you do here. Speaking about the steady state, so the steady state was created a couple of years ago.
Quick question for you, I'm sorry, before you move forward. Define tinkering for us.
I'm sorry, can you say it again?
Define tinkering.
Oh,
Is that
well.
set in stone or
No. What I mean by that is General Services may come in, and I won't pick a project. They may say that we have $6 million, but we actually wouldn't need two of that until 2 years from now based on the project timeline. So you might be able to put that $2 million towards a different project or something along those lines. So the steady state is managed by our CFO and finance. This is scheduled to take effect in 2022, so not this upcoming bond, but the one after it. But it's really a debt model that is built off of a lot of assumptions in interest rate, property tax growth, sales tax growth, spend rates, things like that. I will tell you that if I've been cleared by our CFO to say this, if we just took through FY19 and updated it, the steady state would go up a couple million, 2 to 3 million. But that doesn't mean that that's the amount that we would recommend as a steady state when we approve the budget, because just like our general fund, revenue forecasts, interest rates, things like that will update. It doesn't follow neat fiscal years. So our CFO will work with you guys on the steady state through the workshops in the coming months to try to get to a final plan for the following year. And I won't steal Ty's thunder on the comprehensive plan. I just want to point it out because it does put us in a unique situation from a capital planning standpoint. So we're beginning to talk about the 2022-2024 bonds, which don't have anything populated at the moment. But at the same time, as you'll see here, the 2040 plan is scheduled to get adopted in FY21. So you'll see from the time the plan is adopted, there will be 2 more council budget votes before we really populate that future capital plan. So while we want to ensure that we put capital projects into the planning fund, learn more about them, use CDOT's prioritization, I do ask you guys to think about how you think we should manage this with a comprehensive plan that may really change the goals that you guys have for our capital program. And kind of ending the capital section, the capital planning is a lot less linear than the general fund. So we're really talking about what we're doing with our existing projects and then what we're doing with our future projects. So when we talk about project savings, We tend to do that in the spring so that we know as much as possible about some of the projects that are closing out so we can try to reappropriate that savings. Updating project timelines, as I mentioned, General Services will do shortly, but they may also do it again in April at a workshop. And then updating the affordability model, and then how we add projects to the planning fund and how we assess the results of some of the planning fund work already will be kind of the goals on this budget cycle as we try to develop both the tinkering of the FY21 bond, but then also you guys start to plan your vision and your goals for the future bonds. And so this is really what's driving a lot of this is when you guys talk about the capital program after Tracy and Ty present, and then later on in the day when you talk about the city's goals, we're going to be listening to try to capture some of the deeper dives that you may want in budget workshops where we have 12 hours to populate. And there's a lot of typical things that would be in there, but there's certainly space if there's other things you guys want to know more about. And it'd be nice if you guys help drive it a little bit this year so it doesn't feel like we're deciding what to bring to you. We want to make sure that we kind of prepare you guys for the decisions you want to make in the budget.
Ryan?
Yep.
Would it be something that the council would want to do today is to just kind of put all, like we had the stickies, all of your ideas up so that the budget committee can at least have a kind of a global look at what council's thinking about? So I think that would be good use of our time today if people are prepared to think about it. And I think most are based on the goals that we set yesterday. We ought to have some things that we'd be ready to say, I'd like to see a program, I'd like to see this increased, or it would be great to hear some decreases or some transfers from. But, you know, I think that might be a good use of time today if people are prepared to put just ideas that the committee could take on and prioritize later.
Certainly. Thank you.
If we can insert that into the agenda.
So I'll end on this before the summary slide. This is the budget calendar. You guys likely already have this. So we're building towards a city manager's recommended budget on May 4th, and then hopefully a budget adoption by June 8th. And then finally, just the takeaways for the budget. Fortunately, we do not have any significant concerns for FY19 or FY20 to report. We're fortunate in that our FY21 challenge is still reasonable as in that it's less than 1% of the total budget, and we feel like we can try to attack it from a number of angles. And then also the capital investment plan, talking about we still have that one more bond cycle, and then we need to shift to our future planning while still incorporating the comprehensive plan. So with that, I will turn it forward to questions, although I may have taken the whole 45 minutes.
You really haven't talked much about CRVA at all, but in fact, there's a lot going on there. So we will need to see for CRVA a kind of an analysis like the one you presented for the general fund in terms of what their debt capacity is and what kind of projects they have in the pipeline. Because we've had a number of situations where stuff comes to us and we've had to make decisions about it without any context. So I hope we'll get further into that.
So Councilmember Driggs, they'll be a part of the discussion tomorrow.
All right, thank you.
Any other questions? All right, thank you guys.
All right, before we move on, I got a quick story for you. So some of you know I grew up in Louisiana, northwest Louisiana, Shreveport, which also means I'm quite happy with how that game ended, even though it ended incredibly late. Anyway, I want to tell you a quick story about a company that has its origins in northeast Louisiana, in the Mississippi Delta region. Thanks. because it's actually relevant to everything you're talking about today. So the company started in the mid-1920s, experienced some growth, relocated to Atlanta, 1941. Continued to experience growth. 1950, they are thinking seriously about relocating to Birmingham because Birmingham was actually a better geographic center for their operations, for where their stuff happened. So at the time, 1950, Birmingham and Atlanta are about the same size, about 300,000 people each. Atlanta is not Atlanta as we know today. Atlanta and Birmingham are very similar. This company reaches out to the civic and business leaders in Birmingham, and they're not greeted with overwhelming, yes, come here. In fact, one of the things that Birmingham did is they imposed a tax that in some ways was a disincentive to this particular company. The folks in Atlanta, again, civic leaders, the mayor, business leaders decided, you know what, we see potential impact of this company staying here. So Mayor Hartsfield, I think you know where this story's going, said, Delta, we want you to stay. 1950 to 1980 to 2000 to 2020. Atlanta, with all the positives and negatives that come with growth, and Birmingham took completely different tracks. Were they solely because of that one decision? I doubt it. Was that an incredibly impactful decision and set of decisions? Absolutely. And so decisions that were made in 1950 by the powers that be, elected leaders, business leaders, community leaders, still reverberates today. So 1950, 2020, 70 years later? So 70 years from now is what, 2090? Some of the decisions you will be making in this room and throughout this year, the next 2 years, I don't know what impact they're going to have. Yeah, no pressure. But these are really, really big deals. So with that, I turn it over to Taiwo and Tracy to talk about some of the big deals we got going on.
No pressure at all.
Good morning.
Tigers, yeah.
Good morning, everyone. You all know, y'all have heard me talk for the past 18, I think maybe we're on 19 months now, this new ED strategy. You've seen a lot of it from the business recruitment standpoint of how now we are on the forefront of jobs. And think where we are and what this is largely about is it's time for the next evolution, and it's time to think about how we make our investments and how that is feeding into the great places that we're building, but investing in growing jobs and the quality of life for our residents. And so we want to try to expand our thinking a little bit this morning and look at this in a different approach to our economic development strategies. So today's toolbox hasn't been bad. It has led to some great successes, but we might argue that some of those maybe have been incremental and not as significant in the areas where we really want to see change. And so we want to try to think about how do we better align some of our toolbox, maybe expand our toolbox, to really get to that growth and that equity that we've really been talking about for a long time. And so business matching grants, for example, corridor redevelopment, we had a lot of conversation about that yesterday. We've got some tools. Do we need more tools? Do we need to be more strategic with our tools? And then how do those tools really fit in with the planning efforts that Taiwo and his team are doing? Is all of this layering in to really take our city where we want to go and where we're envisioning it to go?
So again, good morning. So just like Tracy mentioned, I think the tools that we have in our toolbox today have actually resulted in some good things. So as you will see here, over the last 20 years, we've pretty much generated a lot of jobs. But you'll notice a few things about this particular map here. One is that most of the jobs that have occurred in the last 20 years have pretty much been uptown, south end. But the second thing you'll notice is that something that Deb Bryan said yesterday, every thriving city needs a strong center. And that's very evident here in this map, that we do have a very strong concentration of jobs in Center City. But the other thing you will notice, though, is that once you go past Uptown and South End, everything bunches together, whether they be from the west side to the east side. But then quickly, what you will see again is that the east side has a paucity of jobs, and that's over the last 20 years. When we were working on our comprehensive plan, we put together some data that really will engage the community in discussion around the board games. We found out that Center City has about 260-some thousand jobs, which is good, followed by South, which has about 168,000 jobs. The West Side has about 120,000 jobs or more, while the North has about 106,000 jobs. The East Side has 53,000 jobs, or 59,000 jobs. So, and that's evident here. Now, again, like I said, I think the tools that we talked about have really led us to this end successfully, because really, not every city can boast of this in terms of jobs distribution. If you map certain cities that we compete with right now, what you're likely going to see is strong concentration of jobs in their up-center and one other geography, not multiple geographies. Again, going back to what Deb said yesterday, we are a multi-centric city because we've got things happening in other parts of our city outside of Center City.
I think two things to hit on really quickly with this, and just to reiterate some of what Taiwo said, and David, when he opened this up, is that job growth in South End, for example, it's the hottest market that we have in Charlotte right now, but that's 20 years in the making. You go back to early in my career, we were talking about a transit line. So you got to think that these things do take time. But the other thing to what you said, Taiwo, is we've had positive growth, job growth everywhere in our city. How do we keep that going? We might want to see it more in some places than others, but we're pretty fortunate to have that positive job growth, and we need to keep some of that momentum going. So what we want to pivot on a little bit this is a new proactive approach where we're really combining economic development strategies and planning principles. And we're talking about understanding kind of these commercial and high employment areas. They're all unique. You know, I always say when we're recruiting businesses to Charlotte or we're working with businesses to expand, every company is different, and how they look at their decisions is different from, well, it's like we're all different. It's the same thing with these commercial areas. And then what is unique and viable about each one of these areas? And how do we want to consider layering in our vision, your priorities? How do we consider that existing and future market? And then really, what are we going to analyze and implement in each area? I do think that our strategies for these areas are all different.
And sometimes it's that analyze phase where we get stuck. I think we often get criticized for analysis, paralysis by analysis, and yet it's very important. For example, you all remember as part of our transit-oriented development ordinance, we had to do a fiscal impact analysis of that. And we're carrying the same thing forward into our comprehensive plan. But not only that, we're also doing some market realities. There are certain things that we want to see happen, but we also want to make sure that we marry them with what's realistic in terms of market. There's always a way to get a balance between the two. And planning gets criticized often that we plan a whole lot, but without implementing. So that's why we have the line under implement there. That, because ED is really, at the end of the day, about outcomes. And, we are often about process. But how do we make sure that we build that outcome into the process so that eventually when the projects are delivered, they're delivered and that has been factored into the process earlier on?
Yeah, and I think there's another layer between the analyze and implement, and it's really it's deeper understanding and strategy. I joke, I think we've had some conversations about land banking and things like that, and it's really important that we don't want to land bank something and then the city own the problem. What we want is really a strong strategy, and the strategy's got to go beyond just we're going to buy a piece of property and put out an RFP. It's really how are we driving that change and getting further than maybe what a vision plan might do into those real implementation strategies. So what we have come to is really a threefold strategy. And it's the goal being achieving equity in our planning and our investments across the entire city. And all three aspects of this are important. And the first piece is to create the new approach to creating equitable market opportunities. And this is really thinking about our corridors and our different areas of our city where we want to drive change. We talk about Beatties Ford, we've talked about West Boulevard, we've talked about the east side. Eastland alone is not going to change the east side. We can't stop at that. We've got to continue these strategies moving forward. We have made a lot of investments in Beatties Ford. We've been having this conversation for a little while, Angela and I. We've made investments in sidewalks. We've made investments in between the curb, but we're still not seeing the change, right? I mean, we're not seeing the change of where we want to go. And so how are we going to develop a strategy for Beatties Ford to get us where the vision that the city is? The second piece is preserving today's strong employment areas. You know, we can leverage private investment. We can preserve what's strong, keep them successful. We don't want to run into situations where we lose sight of some of our healthy employment areas, and then we're in a position where we're trying to play catch up. So it's about helping them maintain as well as helping them evolve and change as our world of employment changes and our world of how we live and how we live within our city. You want to hit the last one?
Yes, so the last one, of course, would kind of talk more about that. But I want to focus, first of all, though, on the first one, which is the new approach to create. I call them corridors of opportunities, if we would. And we can identify others. But Tracy hit on a really good point there, that one project like Eastland is not enough. There's got to also be what we call corridors of opportunities that can connect origin to destination and places along. I'll go back again to what Deb said yesterday, and that is about people who live in our communities often need experience. And we're going to hear a lot more about that this afternoon, I think, on transit and connectedness. But it's very important that as we look at these corridors of opportunities, we go back to 2 slides or so ago where we say we identify them, we assess them, we do some analysis, including doing some market realities, and then make sure that the implementation piece is folded into the process prior to delivery. But one thing you would notice about these 5 or 6 corridors is that they are also in the area we call the crescent, which is really the challenge that we have as a city. And it's not for lack of investment in those areas. It's just that what are the things that we've done that have really not been yielding fruit, that we need to take a different approach to start doing that. I think we were at a meeting the other time and someone said, South End, it's a miracle. And I think maybe you said it's not a miracle. It took like a long time.
20 years.
20 years to happen. We don't have the luxury of 20 years, of course, to wait. We really truly believe that we can begin to tweak certain things today to change some of the stories around this area quickly. So early this morning, one of our staff said, we want to do a design sprint on West Sugar Creek. And I said, okay, so what exactly does that even mean? And said, well, we've been hearing some of the issues that you all have been discussing, and we want to start taking a good look at that. And I said, okay, that's great, but let's kind of caucus around that, because I'm sure that Tracy's concern, Angela's, or Victoria, or even the manager and the mayor, what everyone has in mind is very important. And I know every time I hear from Councilmember Johnson, if you want to test pilot anything, just bring it to Hidden Valley or West Sugar Creek. So every corridor has its own challenges. There are no 2 corridors that are the same. I want to make sure that we approach that in the same way.
That is true. And I think that's the theme of this is no 2 are the same. It doesn't get us to where we want to go, I think, to necessarily just have a toolbox that we've had. I mean, the toolbox, again, has been good. a facade matching grant is a good thing. I don't want to say that it's not, but is it really getting us the change, the larger corridor change of where we want to go with these? And we really have to, I think, have individual strategies for each one of these corridors about how and where we want to invest.
So Tracy, and Tyler, I agree with you, individual strategy. So let's take the first one, and I think we should parallel the Batesford Road, Roslyn Ferry, as what happened. Oh, you can't, I'm sorry. My ears are stopped up, I'm thinking I'm talking up. So the Batesford Road and Roslyn Ferry, we have a transportation initiative about to take place. We're going to change that corridor. So how do we look at what we were able to accomplish on South End and start planning for that same type of development? And I think the quicker we can do that, the better off we're going to be, because once that train is implemented, that streetcar, the prices in that whole area are going to really change. And so I'm beside the birthday boy here. I said, which one you want to go first? I go first, but I agree, but I just think we need to be more, have a timeline on the Batesford Road, Roslyn Ferry, only because the streetcar is going to take place next summer. And so it needs to be some timeline and some action around that if we're going to be successful.
Oh, and Councilmember Mitchell, that's exactly why they're all unique. You know, that is something that's coming to that corridor that's going to change that strategy that's different than West Boulevard. You know, and it's slightly different than Freedom and Wilkinson. And so that is exactly why we have to have, I think, these individual strategies around these.
And then, I mean, you also have to think about it as well that the type of development that a streetcar mode will have will be different from the type of development that a streetcar, that a light rail will attract, for the most part. I think John will probably speak better to that, which is why we keep saying no two corridors are the same. But we do understand that, because I think somewhere underlying that question is, how do we achieve growth and revitalization without displacement or gentrification? Which is why, again, saying that we make sure that the outcome that Tracy is going for, we fold that in an early stage into the process that we are working on in planning, so that she and her team can deliver the type of project that I don't necessarily think you can avoid gentrification completely, but there could be growth without displacement. And I think that is the key issue, that people, small businesses and residents are not necessarily being displaced while they continue to have access to opportunities and amenities.
Right, and that's, I want to hit to a little bit and bring this back about, again, how this is all layered together, because we are on the forefront of small business initiatives, as well as on the forefront of the jobs. So now we can kind of understand, and we can be strategic about where we're trying to, where and what kind of job growth we're trying to guide into each individual corridor. And so that's another important component of it.
So as you're putting that layer on, I just want to hear you talk a little bit about workforce development as it relates to this. Because I think that's the difference, and that's the key to this displacement piece, that the people that are in the corridors are able to grow with the investment. So how are you all thinking about how do we, whether it's Project Peace or whether it's through our partner organizations, have we started to think about how do we prepare the people in the corridors to be able to be a part of the growth?
Absolutely. So one, and I think you may have heard me say it yesterday, one of the things that we have to do is really understand all of the resources that are out there and better communicate that and tying it together. Where are the gaps? What are the gaps? But one of the things, again, because now we're in the forefront of this job recruitment and job growth, we work with companies all the time in establishing how are they hiring locally, how are we growing those jobs and growing the talent pipeline, and also tracking for them a talent pipeline. Using a big example, but Lowe's, I mean, we did that. We spent half a day and we brought in 13 different groups, from CP to Road to Hire, all different groups from around our community, to say this is how your pipeline is going to track out. Last year when we announced Project Chime, We brought them in. We were very strategic on where we did job fairs, how we did job fairs, and set up that relationship that as people either grow through that organization or come out of that organization, they have the next level job opportunity. And so we now have gotten very strategic. That workforce and talent development initiative and conversation layers in with all of our companies.
So,
Yes.
so in 1990, for an example, there was no such thing as Valentine, right? And so today we have a totally new edge city that we're getting ready to reinvent yet again. Those intersections have been looking the same way in our community for well over 25, 30 years. We put curb, sidewalks, gutter, all the basic infrastructure needs in place to encourage development and growth. And yet, over the last 20, 30 years, there have been little or no development or growth. What are we going to do different other than subject the neighborhood leaders and the business leaders to more planning, charrettes, and studies? And I am sure there is a room in City Hall where good plans go to die. So help me understand how do we, and I respect the planning process. I get it. I understand it. I know it's a necessity. I know we got to do the charts and the green and the yellow. I get it. But help me explain to Ms. Johnson, who's been waiting for change in her community for 40 years.
Can I add to Malcolm, because I think this is a really good discussion, and maybe some of us have been here long enough to see this. In every one of our major successful developments that we consider, the Ballantines, the South Parks, the process has been one owner, one developer goes out and accumulates all of this property, and they create a vision for large amounts of space that we help zone, we help plan, we have all these rules around how you can develop it. But in this environment, we talk about tackling these very tough issues when land is at a premium, and we don't have a single owner. Macquarie Heights has, 200 houses, and they don't have an ownership agreement on the development and making sure their neighborhood stays intact, even though they all individually want that. So I struggle with this because I'm trying to figure out what is the role of the city in the ability to effect change when there are property owners that are looking at ka-ching, 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 but the residents don't have necessarily that same ability to effect change by either large plans intact, or the ability to say we can get this land and make it happen as a neighborhood development. I don't see their pathway, and I'm worried. I'm worried about the same thing happening because we don't control the land, and we haven't ever controlled the land on these corridors. It's either been public property or individual owners that went out there with their $75,000 and bought a house, or had a business that they've leased the space from an owner. We were talking about Victoria's Corner, Remount and West Boulevard. One side has been taken over by the federal assets forfeiture place, and now it's rented to who knows what. But Mr. Jim's Pizza has been an owner, property owner, and a business owner on that corner for 35 years, second-generation minority-owned business. What is that corner going to be when the BP station is leasing from somebody God knows where? How do we actually manage? I'm just really worried about the difference between I own the property and I can sit on it, and we have lots of ownership that want to do what's right for the neighborhood, and how does the city play any role in that?
So, Julie, is your question part of this?
Well, no, I was going to say that too, that when you look at when you look at great revitalizations in Baltimore and Detroit, those were billionaires that came in and sunk a lot of money into, in the case of Detroit and in part in Baltimore, those areas have been vacated. And so it was a lot different to be able to come in and sink billions of dollars into one parcel or adjoining parcels of land, and that, that's kind of what happened with Ballantine. I don't know, I think that ties into what you're saying, but there's a huge difference.
Okay, Renee? And then, because I'm just want to figure out where it's just adding to it, or where you want these guys to respond.
Are there opportunities for the cities to identify development zones? Like identify these 4 or 5 areas, and then the cities start to drive development instead of reacting or following the developers, such as opportunity zones or developing infrastructure, and then being very intentional about the safety and development of these areas, low-income neighborhood grants for the current homeowners, or incentives for employers, so that the city is in front of the development and very intentional in driving it. Is there opportunities for those areas? And that would also affect these hot spots for the safety. It's all combined, the poverty and the crime. So if we as a city could be intentional about these areas and these corridors and driving it, is that something that we could all work together, departments to
Well, I
do?
think that's exactly what we're trying to say, is that we do want to be intentional. It's not a one-size-fits-all. We do, in some cases, have landowners that have come to us. We've got one landowner that my team is working with on Beatty's Ford right now that wants to come in and do the right thing. And so it's, what are the tools that we have to work with them to incent them to do the right thing? So it's not the situation where we need to go buy the land to control it, but we're going to form that partnership with the right property owners. And then how do you build on those to create a nucleus that then creates the change that you're going to?
But why shouldn't we, in some cases, buy the land and control it?
I'm not saying you
Yeah.
shouldn't. I'm just saying that you go into these situations with buying the land with eyes wide open.
I got you.
We have sat on Eastland for a very long time.
Got you.
And
But even
so,
an alternative to
But-
that, why wouldn't we help a neighborhood that you drive over behind Booker Avenue now, $400,000 and $500,000 houses where there were $35,000 houses. Why wouldn't we organize a neighborhood that we've identified, because they don't necessarily have the skill? That's why I like the West Side Land Trust. They're
Yeah.
going in there and they're talking about this, but how do we make that, land is value forever. And if we lose that in this next round on these properties and these sites, I don't know that there's any comeback. So I wonder, how do we organize best practices, business practices, maybe with foundations of companies like a Faison? Why not have the Faison Foundation do this
And
instead
that's-
of the Faison, let's make more shopping center stuff
right.
do it?
And that's the kind of,
Why is
that's
Smith having a foundation around?
That's
gotta
the
think differently.
kind of strategy I think that we're trying to talk about, we want to get to. I'm just hedging against the land banking because it's easy to say, oh, let's go buy land, and then we don't have the real strategy. And so I think if we're thoughtful about it and we pull in the right partners, and we are, and again, that's why it's not a one-size-fits-all too, but that we're very strategic from the identification all the way through the implementation.
And again, I think the mayor brought up a good point, and that's the community land trust, which for the most part is a community-initiated effort in partnership with public agencies. And I think the West Side has done that successfully, but then there are certain factors that have to also be in place in order for that to happen and to be done well. So for all of these corridors, I'll say that we've invested in certain things like Councilor Graham said, sidewalks and maybe gap funding for housing, but now it's time to begin to build on some of those things, and a lot of them are often tied to individual ownership of land, which we really cannot do much about. So it's really striking that balance between land assemblage that we can take control of and then sit on it for a while and be hopeful. I mean, you all know my concern about using the word hope, because it's not a strategy. You know, I mean, I do think it's, Tracy has used that word a couple of times, and that's intentional, is that if we're going to assemble a piece of property, then we have to be intentional about what's next so that we can plan for it, and then it doesn't have to sit for, how long did Eastland sit?
10 years.
10 years,
Eastland's,
okay.
I mean, Eastland's a little different, right? Versus going to a LaSalle Street or Wilson Boulevard and buying a corner lot for development. So they're really not the same thing, right? And so
In scale.
and scale, and I clearly get it. Hope is not a strategy. You're absolutely right. But complacency isn't one either, right? And so, and I'm not picking on you, Ty or Tracy. I'm just driving home the point that we simply cannot have any more studies, charrettes, strategy sessions where we're waiting another 20 years for change. And so I'm going to pitch you guys and the manager, that's where the ball stops, right, him, to come back and tell this council how we can do things different to achieve different results in these quarters, so that I won't be 80 years old still trying to find a sit-down restaurant on Beatties Ford or Wilkinson or West Boulevard.
Well, I'd just like
So,
to say as we wrap
so hang
this
on,
conversation.
hang on. I got Matt.
Oh, I'm sorry, you were
Sorry,
saying.
Matt,
I'm done.
and then Ed, and then Victoria. Oh, wait. But first, city
David, I
manager.
appreciate it. Yeah, so I think it's important. So not me? Okay.
Which I hope this will be helpful. We set this up by design today to begin with the money and the resources, and then what we believe is the most complicated issue we're going to have to address. And so we intentionally put Ty and Tracy up there because they're two different views of this, and we're trying to assemble that. What I will say is that we do have this great point in time, and Ryan talked about it earlier. I'm sorry, I'll get back to you. Okay, what Ryan talked about it earlier is in the 2020 bond, there may be some projects that are not quite ready to go. And we can push those to the 2022 bond. It doesn't mean we're not going to do them, but we don't want money to be approved and we run out of that 7-year clock. So that creates capacity this November. Okay? Some of these areas are CNIPs, where we have put all together, I think $150 million, that includes Southside CNIP, over the course of those 4 bond cycles. And then those are in the pre-reads, all of those things in the toolbox that may or may not work. And those things that haven't given us the results, let's just stop doing them, okay? So we want to hear from you today, however brutal it is, because we don't want to go away into a room, come back with something, and you say, we didn't get council's feedback. So bring it on, we need this, fair enough?
Okay, now it's on me. Thank you, Mr. Manager. So I think it's important in this conversation that we not lose sight of our housing framework and its emphasis on housing preservation, particularly affordable housing preservation in NOAA. So just wanted to say that up front. I really appreciate us placing an equity lens on our economic development within the city. Having said that, it's really glaringly obvious for me, and I can't overlook the fact that on the east side we have a tremendous lack of jobs, falling significantly behind literally everywhere else. And I appreciate our hard work on Eastland. I appreciate it, and I know it was mentioned that Eastland's not going to get us there. Right, and so I'm very much in favor of the idea of us looking at potential land banks. We have lots of empty property on the corridor, just across from the Eastland site. We've got leveled pieces of land, and I'm assuming that at this point in time, it's probably a little bit more affordable than it will be, say, 5-10 years down the road, right? So maybe that's something we could look at. But I wanted to touch on our business investment grants because. This past year, we had reviewed our grant in our grant system and process, and we had reduced our emphasis on location within those grants. And what I mean by that is where we're targeting are the areas that we target for business growth with those grants. And I just wanted to get Ty and Tracy your opinion on how that might impact the equity or our lens of equity or the equity lens that we're using here in trying to assist areas of need catch up, create more local jobs in those areas. And how do we encourage growth outside of the business investment grants? And then also how do we get there say in East Charlotte, I mean, I'm looking at the map here, and we've targeted one specific area, but, you know, given the need, what more can we do beyond just, say, Central Avenue, Albemarle Road, and the Eastland side?
So, Councilmember Newton, I think let's address the bigs first really quick. And we wanted to take the locational piece out of it because it was so kind of black and white. It was, if you go here, you get this. If you go here, you get this. The location discussion is very much a piece of it, but I think we analyze companies on a lot of different ways when we're looking at them. And it's not just where they're going to go. What are they bringing? Are they a targeted industry? What is the community impact that it's going to bring? The location is important to it, but it was more of a layers. And so we were trying to get away from it just being about location. I will tell you that now, one of the great things about the city being in the driver's seat when it comes to expanding and recruiting businesses here is we look at so many different ways to work with them. We have companies that we made major announcements with that did not get incentives, and a large part of that conversation was where's the best place in the city for them to go, and how do we help them get there? And so we talked about facade grants or security grants or things like that in different corridors. I mean, so because we now are on the forefront of knowing what's going on in the planning, knowing what your priorities are, and seeing where the job growth is, we're trying to bring all these together to guide them to get to that full vision that we want to get to. You know, the location piece is important. I have a company right now that we're working with that specifically come to and said, we want to be on the east side. They're just not, they're not finding, they're having trouble finding the land. So we're now actually trying to help them find those different opportunities. And so the more that we interact with the businesses of all different sizes, it's not just the big companies and things like that, the more that we're having the opportunity to interact with them, the more that we can guide them into the corridors, we can guide them into the different areas of our town that make, or our city that make sense.
I think as you pursue this, you should consider, we had one investment program that was wildly successful, the Blue Line. And you look at what happened all along the Blue Line, the investment that took place. But the question that it suggests is, how do we achieve the quality that we want and not gentrify and not put those places out of it? Retail and places, restaurants tend to locate where the money is. And so I think we need to look very hard at exactly what outcome it is we're hoping for. Because if you can't separate the propensity of retailers and businesses to locate where people have incomes, then you're not going to solve this. As soon as you improve a neighborhood, it's going to become unaffordable to people with low incomes. Because the neighborhood improvement doesn't create the income. It just means that people with incomes fill in, and the people who lived there before are driven out. And you can go all the way back to Brooklyn Village, which was a travesty in its day, but that was intended to be an urban renewal program. We thought we were kind of cleaning up the slums back then. And so I think one of the reasons we're experiencing this futility in all these studies is because nobody has really solved that. And it might be good to focus on exactly what it looks like when we achieve what we want in these neighborhoods.
Do you want to address that? Yeah.
Victoria, I'm going to go around. I'll come back.
To that end, I'm very, very interested in doing this on the West Boulevard corridor as soon as we can, simply because we've already been doing a lot of the playbook work and have started to get to that implementation point and really getting very specific about what it is we want to see. There's energy there. The neighbors are clear about what the market can hold, thanks to the market study that was able to be executed. And now we're at a place where it's time to go. Folks are bought in, people understand the challenges, but also the opportunities with making major investment. And to Ed's point, how do we start to where we prepare the people that are there to be able to be a part of the growth? So if you're looking for a place, I'd love to go there. I think we are in a position to start and get some learnings quickly.
Sometimes our regulations are the ones that stifle creativity, and I'll be the first to admit that. But that's, again, the reason we're going through our Unified Development Ordinance process. Sometimes it's at the state level, and we really have no local control over those. But we definitely are pushing the boundaries of what's possible in certain places. And just, you know, there are certain things right now. As part of our Unified Development Ordinance, we've created a list of what we call special studies, which is really projects that come on that the current regulations do not allow for. How can we make sure that as we walk through the ordinance, we fix those things? So we call them special studies. And eventually, when you see the draft of that Unified Development Ordinance, I think Tracy will be very happy because, again, it will streamline the process to be able to deliver certain economic development. Because sometimes people just don't understand what the rezoning process is. They go buy a piece of property only to realize that they can't do what they really envisioned to do there. And so it's really part education, but also part of what we have to make sure that we continue to work on as part of our regulation as well. And it doesn't happen overnight, but it's definitely, we're working on that as well.
So, and one thing I want to add just to that, I think that it's helpful. We've got a lot of areas where we can do a lot of work, but to Councilman Graham's point, you know, we want to move, and so how do we prioritize this list? I think, you know, West Boulevard having the playbook already in place. I think the other thing is I have to compliment council and economic development tools, allowing us to do some pilots and not spend a bunch of time trying to work new policy, but really kind of thinking, and let us experiment a little bit with some different tools that can work in different places. And so, you know, we've got another one with the Opportunity Hiring Grant, with the sole intent of that is to get local hires in businesses in the places that we want them. And so you guys have been good to let us get a little bit creative too and kind of move some ideas forward and test.
Question. We've identified these areas. These areas, as has been said, have been looked at for years. As we continue to grow, as more people continue to come in, and people just move around, period, where do you think is the next dot that's going to be placed on this map that we have to think about that we're not thinking about right now?
So
I got my own ideas.
The top 3 cities where people come from to move to Charlotte are New York, Atlanta, and Columbia, South Carolina. New York and Atlanta have transit that people get to rely on. So as people come, they're likely going to go to corridors where there's already some bus services for them, for the most part, or light rail. I truly believe that every single one of these corridors is within a half-mile radius of a light rail or even a quarter mile of a bus service. So most likely there will be people who will continue to move there, not only because those amenities are available, but also because they are affordable to live at. If we're going to look at any corridor at all, I think there will be more like Steel Creek, you know, but they're more like open fields where people can still build and develop, much more than infill.
That was my river district.
Yeah.
And you look at the area on the west side where we haven't seen as much growth, and there's still the opportunity, I think, is the next place that we're not talking about on here. And we have it highlighted in the next slide, but it's just one where there's just open opportunity.
So Matt, you had another question or comment?
Well, comment really. So I just wanted to build upon Ed's comment a moment ago and say that we do have the tools at our disposal to meet our goals here. And we just need to shift the direction in which we operate so that we're making sure that growth occurs in a smart way. And what I mean by that is looking at things. So I was mentioning earlier, looking at things like housing preservation, and ensure that we're not, increasing population density in areas that already have an existing need for other types of amenities like economic development, allowing those areas to catch up. So, and we can do that, by implementing our framework to ensure that we aren't displacing people at the same time. So just wanted to say that those tools do exist. It's just a matter of rethinking the way in which we operate.
So I know you guys have some more slides to cover. We do need to put a hard stop on this at 10, just because we got other stuff to get done. Other questions, comments,
Yeah,
Malcolm?
But when we wrap this up, I want to make sure that we get some action steps, that we just don't leave this conversation and leave it. And James and I and others have kind of got some thoughts in terms that we want to kind of see as a result of the conversation. One, if we can identify foundation and business partners who will work under the equity development policy in those corridors specifically. Two, if we can choose the Batesville Road corridor as a priority because of the investment we've already making there with the streetcar. And then lastly, can we define a model for a neighborhood small business engagement to test on the priority of the corridors? And so I'll share that so we can put it on the board.
Yep.
But I just don't want to leave this conversation with just, you know, having a conversation.
Right.
So that there's some action steps, and there may be some others, Mr. Manager, that we want to add to it. But if we just can kind of focus on those, and I think that would be a good step forward.
And Malcolm, what I would ask is those specific things you just read off, please ensure those are on individual Post-it so we know where they are and we've got them captured.
All right, gotcha.
If they're just in your individual notes, then we may
I
not
got
get
you.
them.
I got you. We'll put it on our postcard and we'll.
Perfect. And then we'll put another board up for
We'll put it on the
specifically
board.
capturing this. There's also the parking lot over here that's
No, we don't want to park.
not
that.
labeled.
We want to put that
Absolutely.
on the board.
Yeah.
I want to say
So Mayor, then
that
Renee.
while we may be choosing a corridor, we don't stop working on all of them.
That's
Some
the
of
next
this is
thing.
going to be
Yeah.
sequential, and that if we choose some development partners, they may say, well, this is the corridor that's best.
Yes.
We may push something, but if we ought to go where there's the opportunity for change.
Yes.
And the best result.
Yes.
And so I think that we may think that we know, but I really want us to look at the Detroit model, which is a foundation model, and where developers have created great foundations because they've done so well for the last several decades. And then I think that there are some business folks that don't see it as just, how do I make a lot of money and
Right.
move on? So those two criteria may help us define how we best utilize a model. So I endorse Malcolm's next steps.
Okay.
I see on the economic development page that many of these areas are identified in the opportunity zone, or we have opportunity zone. Can you give us a little information about opportunity zone and implementing it in these areas?
So opportunity zones, and I think the mayor said it yesterday, you know, with the federal regulations and where we are, it's a very fluid subject. We have talked about it extensively with council and in committee over the past year. We have an outside group that we've been working with of what I consider kind of OZ experts, but OZ experts within different perspectives. So developers, legal, accounting, some neighborhood associates. So we just kind of trying to bring the different perspectives and understandings of opportunity zones together to come forward with recommendations. We have launched a website to help put the opportunities out there. We also have talked about working with developers on specific things when they are doing the types of developments that we really want to see in our community, like things like expedited permitting and things like that in some of those programs. So that's where we are right now, but it is still, I would say, an evolving conversation because the initiative is somewhat fluid with the feds and regulations. So can we move on? Are you good?
Thank you. So I want to do, can you hear me? Okay. Okay. How about now? There you go. So you had mentioned when you were reaching out to companies for locating in some of these areas, you had mentioned that land, availability of land is an issue. Is it the office space that they're looking for, or is it just the vacant land?
In this particular case, the one I was mentioning on the east side, it was land itself. It wasn't office space. It was land itself in terms of what they were looking for.
Got it. So I remember having a conversation back in 2017 with some folks who were part of this whole business recruitment effort. And the topic that had often come up was around availability of the office space when we're trying to recruit jobs and opportunities in some of these parts of our city. I know other cities have looked at creating and developing office space so that companies can relocate in some of these neighborhoods. Has that something, have we explored in the past?
We have not explored, or at least my team has not explored, purchasing office space, having office space for specific opportunities necessarily. It's kind of the same conversation as land banking. I think if you're going to go down that, we need to be very specific about where it is and what it is and things like that.
But if see, when it comes to land banking, if you're not able to find a master developer, okay, who is going to develop this office space, we have to take a step further. If we are going to develop office space, would we be able to bring opportunities and jobs? And that's something I think we got to look at. I know other cities have done that, where they have been able to successfully bring jobs and opportunities by being that master developer and have revitalized neighborhoods and areas where there was no private sector interest. So I think that's something we got to explore and see if that will help revitalize some of these areas. Second question, I know you had mentioned about facade and security grant. Are these tools that we are currently offering to small businesses, are they sufficient? Are they enough? What are their feedback? Because when I talk to folks, their feedback has been different, that that's not enough, especially those that are along this corridor that are struggling to survive. So have we done some sort of survey from these small businesses that shows, this is what we need, and here are the tools that you are offering that we can expand on?
Well, I think that's exactly the point, is saying that the security grant, the facade grant, those aren't bad things. They have been successful for some businesses, but perhaps we need to consider other tools, because those couple of tools alone aren't everything that we need. All right, so we're going to go ahead and go to the next slide. This was the second piece of the larger strategy, which was preserving successful employment centers. And this is where we're watching the market necessarily, or the market's guiding us, if you will. And these are areas that are strong, but they're not necessarily without issue. And when the market is talking to us, I think we need to be in a position where we can respond and react. But we also need to think about preserving these areas and allowing them to evolve. The university, I will tell you guys, I think we personally, our team worked with about 8,000 job announcements last year. Right now, today, I'm chasing 7,000 jobs in the university area. And all of those jobs are on the west side of 85, and the light rail's on the east side. And so the light rail's there, they want to be connected to the light rail. When we talk to these companies, congestion and connectivity is an issue up there. And so it's great that we have the light rail, but we've got to continue to think about how to better connect employment and transit up there, more specifically. So, there's 70,000 jobs in the university area right now, so I'm talking about a 10% increase that is looking at us in 2020. Not the actual jobs, but the announcements to the jobs. And so it's significant, and it's something that I don't have right now any tools to respond to that. The uptown, we have significant projects uptown that may or may not have CIP requests associated with them. We have 7th and North Tryon. We have the Transportation Center, which we don't anticipate, but we don't know yet. Gateway Station, again, we've tried to be clear about our tools, but there could be CIP requests as associates to that. But all of that, again, is growing what we have in a strong employment area. Then you have Ballantyne. Can I run through them really quick? Okay. Then you have Ballantyne. You all have the rezoning in front of you. That is a strong employment area today. They want to evolve because suburban office that's not connected, overlooking a golf course, is not necessarily what people want today. It's what they wanted 20 years ago. And Northwood recognizes that. So they are trying to evolve into more of a mixed-use place that continues a strong employment. That comes with a CIP request associated with it to build out more roads and better connectivity, which is one of the struggles of the area, of congestion. So again, I point all of these out to simply make the point that a lot of these are successful areas. How do we leverage private investment to keep them successful?
And that's one of my points about working with developers. Northwood Raven local understands what's going on, and if they are going to, and if you looked at their ownership model, how could we duplicate that kind of ownership model for development on our corridors? It's just one of those things that's a real life example of how to get things done.
So you mentioned up in University how those jobs are on the west side of 85 and disconnected from this light rail investment that we've made. But isn't this a perfect laboratory up there to do some of the things that we've been talking about? You have Harris Boulevard, which is not a Providence road, so there's a lot more room to do things like busing, bus rapid transit, create a transit hub that brings people from the light rail station to those office parks, some type of public-private partnership that we can make. You have a strong residential up there, so why wouldn't we just
And that's exactly what we're trying to do. We're trying to look at what are the infrastructure investments that need to occur. How do we best leverage that with the multiple companies that are looking at job growth there? We have a planned bridge over 85 that connects behind University Place into the research park, for example. That's another model. What is the timing of that in relation to when do the jobs arrive? We've even talked about, I've talked to John about, can we run a pilot of autonomous vehicle, people mover?
So how do we go from that here today into making that happen?
I think it's goes back to the old plan thing. So we've got a plan. So we do have but this is really about mobility plan. I think Silicon Valley is a classic example. So you have Valley Metro, VTA, whatever they call it in San Jose, that provides light rail, but it doesn't get necessarily to Facebook or Google, all of those, but they do have shuttle services that connect with the closest transit centers. And each one of them also has what's called transportation demand management tool, where they have their own shuttles that actually bring their employees to the stations and all. Those are all the types of things that, looking at Lee's way in the back there, that we're going to be talking about in terms of mobility plan that can be implemented and deployed to this type of environment.
I'd like to see us do that.
And let me just add on to that a little bit, because we had a meeting last week where we talked about a different approach. Rather than a rezoning here or a traffic analysis here on one site and all this, to step back and look at the university area and say, what are the most needed improvements from an infrastructure standpoint in kind of the order? And then how do we use all the company expansion to leverage that? Where do we want to make our own investments? And then where can we try some innovative things? And what are the partnerships with some of the companies to try some innovative things? And so it was a multi-layer approach, from the actual roads to then the transit connection piece of it, and then potentially even pilot or innovative ideas.
I know David is nudging us to move on. So this is the second to the last slide, and this is the third piece. So we talked about new approach, just creating new markets, preserving existing success stories that we have right now. And the third piece is this. So you will notice here that we're making a shift from placemaking to community making. Said it before, shift happens, but this is a good shift in terms of A place. Okay. A place.
It's all right. You got this. You got this.
So a place does not necessarily make a community, but a community can be a place. And the whole idea is that we've been talking a lot about placemakings, and a place could be a bus stop, it could be a transit stop, it could be a plaza, like a government porch. But what is a place? I mean, what's a community? A community has to be a string of places. And so the whole idea is as we create all these different places, as we make all these places in the city, we're actually creating or making a community. So how can we leverage the investments that we have right now in different places that can really revitalize communities? I always say that the places that we make or the communities that we make are like little hinges that swing huge doors. They're really almost like thinking small, in that you talked about making the United Indian Association had the graphic at the bus stop on West Boulevard. Imagine a series of bus stops that have beautiful hearts along them. They create a sense of community without resulting in displacement or gentrification. And so how do we leverage the presence of transit? How do we preserve affordable housing? How do we make sure that some of the sidewalks that we have today, or even improvement in stormwater drainage, it may sound very, very, unsexy, but the fact is that it does create a sense of community. So in a lot of all these places, whether they be the new market areas or what we call those corridors of opportunities, or they be the Ballantines, there are always aspects and places in those areas where we can really leverage, continue to and they don't take a whole lot of investment to make happen, but the dividends out of them are huge.
We pressed Taiwo really hard last week when we were talking about placemaking. We kind of came back and said it seems so soft, but it's not. When you explained it was really community making, and the first two buckets of what we talked about are all about employment. It's jobs, but those are good. We absolutely need those, and that's where a lot of our vision and planning falls short. Is it doesn't get to the job piece. So we got to bring the job piece into that, but without these other things and layering that in, you're not creating the community that you want, even if you do add the jobs.
So we talk again about if you're creating communities, it means people ought to be able to live within 10 minutes or 15 minutes of where they work without having to go across town. But finally. Yes,
last slide. So what we wanted to do with this is layer in where we started, see where the job growth is, see the areas that we're focusing, and then the areas that we're trying to preserve too. And so you follow the steps with our new role in job creation is so important into moving this forward. And then also adapting to market changes and market realities. No two corridors, no two employment centers are the same. And identifying encouraging public-private partnerships. It's a great example of what the mayor hit on. And then using the comprehensive plan as that guide for the future, along with the market realities.
So sometime in the next few weeks, we're going to share with you our preferred growth scenario. So when I came to you several weeks ago, I said we were looking at the models of Austin, Portland, I believe Arlington, Virginia, in terms of models of growth. Whether the growth that we're expecting will be along corridors or around activity centers or in neighborhoods. With what we've had from about 5,000 people in the community, we continue to see a hybrid of two. People envision that the growth will be along corridors, existing corridors and future corridors, but also around activity centers. So when you see that preferred growth scenario, you will see that kind of mirrors that. So how do we make sure that these places are ready for the next step in terms of 7,000 jobs? That's a lot of jobs in one place. And then they will need to work and live in different places. How do we make sure that we leverage transit if it's a mile away or 2 miles away? How do we make sure that we bring it closer to people? So you're going to see that when we bring the preferred growth scenario to you in a few weeks' time. And part of that also is really to support what Tracy and her team are doing in attracting businesses and jobs to our community. So with that, I think
we're done.
We're done.
That does sound like a good shift. Yeah. We're going to take a 15-minute, thank you for that. Thank you, one person. We're going to take a 15-minute break. we're going to come back in and progress, perhaps with a slightly different or significantly different plan for this morning. How about them Tigers? friends, it's that time again. So we are going to deviate once more from our planned agenda to ensure that we are making your time together as valuable as possible so that your outputs are most usable for staff to then do stuff that then they can put back in front of you that you can make informed decisions on. So do I have, who am I missing? 1, 2, I'd have to count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We're going to go with 8. And a mayor. So 7 plus, yeah, always forget. 11 plus 1, is that a fair way to state it? So we are going to organize ourselves back, unless,
We're going to organize ourselves into the small groups for discussion, but we've got additional people now to organize, so we're going to, I'm going to work with the group leaders to kind of move some things around so that we all have an opportunity to share varied viewpoints and views. So I'll get that done right now.
and what we are going to be discussing, as Ryan mentioned earlier, and Mayor, I'm looking to you because I'm flying by wire here, that our revised approach for the next hour is to, you have 3 budget committee, I think those are 4-hour sessions, is that right? Coming up, or regardless of the length. You've got 3 budget workshops. What we want to do right now is back into those 3 groups you were in yesterday, plus augmented with other staff, I think that the mayor's working on now, is we want you to discuss and be prepared to share 3 responses to 3 questions. And they are, what should you be discussing in the budget workshops based on the priorities from your discussions yesterday, right? What should be the topics of discussion in those 3 workshops is number 1. Number 2 is, what are the desired outcomes from your perspective from those budget workshop discussions? So what do you want to talk about? What are the desired outcomes? And then 3, what additional information would be valuable for you to have prior to those budget workshop discussions? So again, based on your priorities and conversations from yesterday, what topics do you propose to discuss in those budget workshops? What are the desired outcomes from those budget workshops? And what additional information might you need or want prior to those discussions to make them most valuable for you? And you'll be talking based on the groups you were in at the end of the day yesterday. So we're going to give you about 25 minutes or so, 30 minutes to chat. The same group. Nope. Sorry. Same categories, but slightly different people.
So great neighborhoods, Malcolm, Braxton, Mark, and Renee. Workforce, Hart, Smudgy, and who am I leaving out? Yes. Workforce and small business, Julie, Matt, Victoria, Hugh. Who did I leave out? Did I leave somebody out? Dimple. Dimple was with Workforce, and I'll join the Tate group. We'll have to come up with a better name.
Can you say that again? Can you read that again?
Great Neighborhoods Group would be Malcolm, Braxton, Larkin, and Renee. Workforce and small businesses would be Tark, Smudgy, and Ed. And Tape would be Julie, Matt, and Victoria.
It's so hard to stay away from that room. Oh my God, yes.
So do you
Too late.
I'm trying to decide. That's what I was just chewing on. I just want to hear Ed talk about this.
What is he going to talk about?
I don't know. That's why.
No, he's the chair. You're going to plan what he's going to talk about.
No, I don't mean the. I want to hear how he thinks about it. That's what I'm saying. I don't know. I'll probably put it between the shoes.
It's an assignment, Victoria.
We need the balance.
Yeah. We need some balance. Tracy, we have some staff. Will the staff for the same groups please show up? I'm sorry, where are you? I know you don't get to sit in the back. Where's John Lewis? Oh, would you, Donata, we need the team that's working on these groups to come to the tables, so.
So are we talking specifically about what we want to see for neighborhoods in the budget or?
Okay, so first point number one, each has a topic of area that's a council focus. What topics do you think are important to be on the council budget workshop agenda? Okay? And then we'll do, after each group reports which topic they think ought to be on the workshop agenda for 30 minutes, then we go 30 minutes and see where the consensus of the entire council is. So you get to weigh in on all. But yesterday, would it be helpful, I'm going to turn these, Angela, would you help me do this? So what, if you were to achieve these big goal statements, what needs to be discussed in the budget for the next year? And that's both separate, if you have time, separate operating from capital, guys. Can you do that? We're combining safe and great communities over here, okay? All right. Everybody good?
And the output from the Great Neighborhoods Group is
Yes, we have copies, yeah. Oops, sorry, Kay.
that's what we're doing, right?
I don't know if we want the desired outcome. I just want to know what information you need to make it a valuable discussion.
All right, here we go. Now, do you see what I meant about handwriting? That was me trying to take my time. All right, friends, that actually brings us to an end of the time we have allocated for this discussion. However, so if I can get your attention, so we're at the end of the time we allocated for this just conversation. We actually extended it, right, so you could extend and have a more meaningful conversation. What we have, and this is where we're time boxed in. So lunch is available. We'll start our panel discussion at 11:30, and that's scheduled to run for an hour and 15 minutes. We'll take another break after that, and then we'll decide, does it make sense to come right back to this and have our report out, or to do that later today, or even do it in the morning? Okay, we'll decide all that together. But for now, lunch is served. We'll reconvene at 11:30.